be here, and even more excited you could all join us for our talk tonight. Not guilty by reason of zombification, law and forensic psychiatry after the zombie apocalypse. So let's get started. My name is Dr. Eric Bender. This is my colleague, Dr. Kaveen Kambam, Dr. Kozio, sit down the ends, and we are broadcast law. We're forensic psychiatrists. We specialize in psychiatry that overlaps with legal issues. And we are joined today, I'm very excited to be with our colleagues.
Hi, my name is James Daly. I'm the creator and co-author of Law in the Multiverse, a blog that explores and explains legal concepts using examples from comic books and other related media. And I'm here with my co-author.
My name is Ryan Davidson. I'm also an attorney. We co-author the blog and our book, The Law of Superheroes, came out last October.
All right, so you're all here to talk and hear about zombies. So we all know zombies don't exist. But for those of you who are not sure, you can breathe a sigh of relief because the CDC released some news last year that there is no zombie apocalypse. But what if there were? Are you ready for a zombie attack? And if not, let's at least hope you're ready for our talk. The overview for today, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about hypothetical legal scenarios that might come up in a zombie apocalypse. We're also going to talk about hypothetical forensic psychiatric scenarios. We're going to do a mock trial, and in this mock trial, I will be the judge. We will have the prosecution here from Ryan. We will have James be the defense, and the expert witnesses for the prosecution, Dr. Kozios at the end, for the defense, Dr. Kambam here. And then at the end, if there's time, we'll do Q&A. All right, so apocalypse. There are many kind of stages that you see out there in zombie films and zombie fiction. But it'll be easier to discuss our hypothetical scenarios today if we break up the apocalypse into stages. So we just divided it into 4 stages. First, tends to be an outbreak, some type of infection, or some other large-scale disaster. Then, stage 2, we have the government collapse and the zombie apocalypse. This is where things just fall apart. But you see stage 3, where you have factions and partial order. There might be survival groups that have come together, splinter military groups. And then, assuming we make it to stage 4, people are going to have to answer for their actions in stage 2 and 3. So stage 4 is humans back in control and a restoration of societal governance. So the outbreak. Now, what police powers would the government have in the case of an outbreak? Now, when you're sick, you go to the hospital. But if the government notices that there is a lot of infection all of a sudden and too much, then they can take measures to contain and control the disease. The government has the power to step in, and this can restrict your individual rights. What powers does the government have in an outbreak? Well, they can quarantine, which means they can put people aside into an area to contain the spread of the disease and to limit new diseases. Now, in addition to that, we will call on one of our colleagues here to explain what exactly is the timing. When would you kind of want to quarantine something? Well, it really depends on an epidemic. And what's an epidemic? Dr. Kamba?
I need a mic. So an epidemic is basically where you've got the occurrence of a certain disease more often in a certain population or setting than you would expect. So for example, if you have 10 cases of flu here in Anaheim, all of a sudden we have thousands of cases of flu. They would call it an epidemic.
And James, some legal information.
So quarantine is something that both the states and the federal government can do. The states have really broad powers to quarantine people and houses and things like that. The federal government can also do it, but the federal government is much more limited. It can really only act to prevent the spread of infection across state borders and across international borders with the United States. So while it can also be involved, it's going to be more limited.
And if the individual refuses treatment, we might have other limitations, such as involuntary treatment. And this is forcing people to receive treatment. Ryan?
Under most circumstances, you have the right to refuse medical treatment. This is considered a very important right, but it's limited. And in epidemic situations, that right can go away. The courts recognize that when the government is acting to control the spread of infectious disease, they can force you to submit to medical treatment. And the states have have broad powers in this area.
Now, what if a quarantine is not working? What if the treatments are not working? What if there is no treatment? Well, the next step, often seen in zombie films or zombie shows, is the government enforcing martial law. So the government in martial law is rigidly imposing law and order. They are trying to enforce, by shutting down society, they're trying to enforce their rules. And if people are not obeying those rules, they can use force to enforce those rules.
Martial law is a term that you hear a lot, but it doesn't really have a specific meaning legally. Governors do not stand up and say, I declare martial law. That's not really what it means. So when we look at martial law, we have to look at who is sort of imposing martial law and what are they doing. So it could mean several things. It could mean, for example, the use of the National Guard by a state governor. It could mean the use of the regular armed forces, the national military, to enforce state law. Now that's normally prohibited by what's called the Posse Comitatus Act, but it's allowed under some exceptions provided in the Insurrection Act. And that was invoked, for example, during the 1992 LA riots. And I think we could all expect the zombie apocalypse would be significantly worse than the LA riots. Another example is on application of the state legislature to protect the state against domestic violence. Basically, the state begged the federal government for help. This was considered but not invoked during the Detroit riot in 1967. And again, zombie apocalypse probably at least as bad. You can all be so sure.
All right. But then what happens if martial law fails? Then you get people zombie. This happens. So let's say the zombie apocalypse has happened. We've reached stage 3. Let's say, however, we get to stage 4, and some kind of order has been restored. So what do we do?
Well, I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to start suing. The only question is, who do we sue?
Can we hold someone liable for causing the apocalypse? Right.
This is the product's liability case from hell. Unless we're going to assume that the government is somehow complicit in the zombie apocalypse, which happens in some stories. If that is the case, then they're probably going to try and shield whoever was responsible for liability. But if they weren't, if this was an unforeseen side effect of a legitimate project, I think the rage virus was a side effect of a cancer cure 28 days later, it could have been accidental. This is basically a weapon of mass destruction. And preparing and possessing biological weapons is a federal crime that carries a life sentence, and the judge is going to throw the entire book at you on this one. There's also civil liability, again, it could be products liability. The damages here are going to be completely astronomical. If this is a corporation, it's going to cease to exist, assuming it's at all. If it's an individual, yeah, the damages are so large it's to be almost meaningless.
So we've talked about if there's a product, there's going to be liability. If there's an accident, it's going to depend on negligence, whether they were taking appropriate steps to safeguard against release or whatever, appropriate security. If it was intentional, then obviously that's a problem. But what if the company did not intend for it to get out, but some rogue employee, disgruntled employee let it out? It is the company liable for the action of the employee? Well, ordinarily no, but there might still be ways to get at the company by, for example, arguing negligent hiring, negligent entrustment, saying, well, the company should have known that the employee was up to no good or had an agenda or an ulterior motive. And moving on, sometimes, as we saw from the example of Umbrella Corp in the Resident Evil series, as some of you may know from the movies or the games, that there's sometimes a cure or a treatment that the responsible party is holding on to or withholding. And they could be doing this either because they want to see what happens with the virus, or they want to make some money maybe, and the price isn't right. What are the options? What can the government do? And it turns out the government can seize private property for public use under the Fifth Amendment, but there's a catch. It has to pay just compensation. I mean, if in this case, just compensation would probably be billions of dollars. I mean, a cure for zombies would be pretty valuable. But if the company that was holding on to the cure was liable for the problem in the first place, then the government's not going to have to pay anything. That's what we would call unjust enrichment. that's not going to be a problem.
But what about medical malpractice? Is there any grounds for that?
Actually, as forensic psychiatrists, we will frequently testify in medical malpractice cases. And one of the things that they use us for is to determine if the standard of care was deviated from or neglected. So if, let's say hypothetically, we are in stage 4, order is starting to be restored, there's hospitals running, and now we have transplants, well, standard of care would probably be to screen the organ, make sure you don't have the zombie virus before I put it in someone that's healthy. Let's say I didn't do that, I got someone infected, you potentially could have a medical malpractice suit there.
And something that courts are going to look to with medical malpractice is this is going to vary from state to state. So factors that they often consider when looking at the standard of care is things like, was the doctor a specialist or a general practitioner? What kind of facilities did they have available? How much information was known about the virus? If this kind of thing happens really early on, when they don't know much about the zombie disease, then the standard of care is low. If you have a general practitioner in a small town, that's going to be very different than a pathologist, infectious disease specialist at a big research university in a big city. They're going to be held to a higher standard.
Right. So we've talked about liability for stage 1. But what about liability for acts that occur during stage 2 and stage 3? Brian?
Well, basic rule here is that just because law and order breaks down doesn't mean that it's open season on other people's stuff. During the apocalypse, there could potentially be criminal liability for a variety of property crimes. Trespassing, pulling up on someone's house without permission. Burglary, breaking into a building with the intent to commit a crime. Looting, theft, conversion, these all involve different species of taking people's stuff with different degrees of severity. And even price gouging. A lot of states that are prone to natural disasters have laws that make it illegal to jack up the price on goods during disaster situations, and this would probably count.
So we talked about property crimes. How about crimes against humans?
Is that how you say hello? Where you coming from?
Oh my god, I can't believe I should. Where are you?
Right. Crime against humans. Okay. What about failing to meet someone? Now, you might recognize here from the episode of The Walking Dead Clear, the lonely hitchhiker at the side of the road, who was begging for help from Rick Grimes and Michonne and Carl, and Rick Grimes decided to say this. Thanks for back. Is there any issue with failing at aging?
So we have to say is simply failing to rescue or help somebody a problem. And as a general rule in the United States, there is no duty to rescue or aid another person unless there's a special relationship between the person in danger and the person who's potentially rescuing or helping them. So for examples of that include spouses, parents and children, or if you're the one who created the problem, or if you voluntarily started to help them out, you kind of have an obligation to continue helping. A few states, like Minnesota and Vermont, do impose a duty to rescue, but it's only required if it can be done without endangering yourself. And in a zombie apocalypse, that's unlikely